Hello and welcome to You Can Ask That, an initiative of the Journalism, Education and Research Association of Australia, supported by the Judith Neilson Institute for Journalism and Ideas. I'm Andrew Dodd, the editor of the collaborative university publication The Junction, and in a moment you'll hear from two of Australia's best political journalists, Barrie Cassidy, the presenter of Insiders, and Patricia Karvelas, host of RN Drive. Both are highly respected political analysts at the ABC and have access to the who's who of Canberra. The work of journalists in reporting and assessing the claims of political parties is central to our democracy and has a big impact on how we vote. Time now for a masterclass in political journalism, with journalism students across Australia asking the questions.
Barrie Cassidy, hello.
Hello, PK.
The first question comes from Edith Cowan University. How do you deal with a politician like Fraser Anning?
That's not a hypothetical question. I had that experience on Sunday about how to deal with Fraser Anning. What we did is we put together a package that properly demonstrated the feeling in the Parliament against Fraser Anning, gave him and one or two of the people behind him an opportunity to express their point of view. So the audience got to hear the whole thing in context. And then at the end of it, I said Fraser Anning was never elected. He was there because of a resignation. He will never be elected. He's an accident of history, so let's move on to the budget. So, in other words, we gave him, I think it was fair that we gave both sides of the audience an opportunity to hear what it was that made people so angry about Fraser Anning, but we didn't dwell on the topic. We didn't make a meal of it.
I think that's a good way to deal with it, but it is a complex issue, isn't it? How to deal with people with extreme views who are actually in the Parliament. You're right, he is an accident of history, wasn't actually elected, but either way, he became a senator.
Yeah, and it's only because of this latest arrangement where we've lost so many people through the citizenship issue and for other reasons, that we're now getting people coming through the system who were not introduced to the public along the way. And they have very extreme views. And this next question, in fact, is a follow-up to that. Do you think there are certain politicians who shouldn't be given a platform?
I think that is a really important question and actually one that journalists are grappling with right now. My personal view, and I think journalists have different views, although we broadly, I think, agree, is that you have to be very careful about the platform, but equally you need to hold people to account. Now, someone like Pauline Hanson is a great example. She is elected as a senator. She has a political party that is definitely at the fringes, but does, generate a substantial vote, particularly in Queensland. So do you ignore her and say, we're not giving her a platform? Many of my listeners, viewers say that we should. My personal view is that that doesn't answer the fundamental question of journalism, which is holding people to account, that you interview her, you subject her to difficult questions like all politicians. And in fact, Barrie, if I can give you a plug, that's what you did on Insiders. You interviewed Pauline Hanson, you asked her difficult questions, and in fact, she ended up really making a very difficult situation for herself on issues like immunisation, right?
Yeah. You can't deny any politician a platform. I mean, that's they're elected, unless you get through as Fraser Anning did, but they're elected and therefore you can't deny them a platform. But you raised Pauline Hanson. The issue there is Channel 7 gives her more than a platform. They give her a standing start every week and in fact pay her as a politician. And I think that's wrong, but they're entitled to do it. They're not the ABC, they're a commercial organisation.
No, it's not illegal.
They can do whatever the hell they like. But I'm entitled to say it's wrong.
Yeah.
I think it's wrong to pay a politician and to give a politician that much airspace when they don't represent a lot of people.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's disgraceful to give them a platform like that because, again, the payment is an issue, but it goes without challenge. And without challenge is dangerous, especially when really dangerous ideas which divide Australia are raised and aren't challenged. All right, question number 3. How do you break through the party line to get their individual opinion?
That's a really good question. And I never really thought about it in simple language. How do you break through the party line? I think probably the only way is to say that. To say that to them before you ask the question. Now look, I don't want the party line on this. I want to know what you really feel about a particular issue. If it's an issue around conscience votes, like the same-sex marriage, for example, then you would expect to get it. But there are other issues where you know there's a party line and you'll get the party line. So I guess the best way is to simply make that point. Try and shame them into saying something that they really believe.
I completely agree, and I do it all the time on RN Drive. Every night I'll say, I want to know what your view is. And to be honest, my strike rate's pretty good.
Yeah.
Often even cabinet ministers will say, all right, well, I think this would be a better course. And particularly the differences, for instance, between the moderates and the Conservatives, you'll get a different line. You know, Simon Birmingham, for instance, and he's a leading moderate, he's the Trade Minister now, he'll say, well, on One Nation preferences, I think this. So you will get an individual line. Other Cabinet Ministers will say, no, I'm not going to go down that road, I'm a Cabinet Minister. So you've got to give it a go, but I do think be transparent about it. But I do think it's important that you do ask, because people want to know where people are coming from, and that's how they make their decisions. This question, Barrie, comes from RMIT. What if they want a list of questions beforehand?
Now that's an interesting one, because most of them do, and they don't get it. It's not. In fact, it's almost now par for the course that before a Sunday interview, on the Saturday I get a call from the politician that I'm interviewing, or if not the politician, certainly a senior staffer, but usually the politician. And I'm not going to give them a list of questions. What I will do is say, look, I'll give them headline issues. We're going to raise Adani, we're going to raise, like with Josh Frydenberg at the weekend, obviously Bill Shorten's cancer initiative and so on. Headlines, but never is that an exhaustive list. Like, it doesn't prevent me from going to other topics.
I always say I might change it.
Yeah, that I don't want to tip them off about, so there'll always be those issues. I don't mind giving them headlines because I don't think you're giving much away at all. When I'm doing a foreign minister, for example, and I used to do this with Alexander Downer and Julie Bishop, because I've worked in government and I know what happens when they're about to do a major interview. The public servants work until dawn and they cover all bases, and they give them long briefs on every potential interview topic to save them the worry and to keep the politicians kind of focused on what really matters. I will exclude issues and I'll give them headline issues, right? So that's just a practical thing, but that's not giving them an advantage. I think it's just a reasonable thing to do.
I completely agree with you, and I have the same process. And it's interesting that we do, because we don't workshop it. People think, oh, do you all know? But we obviously have come to the same conclusion based on it seems the most ethical or fair. I will never give them the questions, and I bet most journalists are like that. I don't know any who give the questions. I'll do the same, the topics, the broad areas, but I will always say, if something comes up, I'll ask it, sorry. And I've got to say, politicians have raised it as an objection. I'm just going to put it out there. Yeah, you asked and I didn't know. And I go, oh, well, it came up. I'm sorry, but I didn't deliberately try and trick you, but I do think that, I have to do it.
In any case, the topic, the question, only gets the conversation started. That's just the starting point. It's from there on that it gets interesting, and they don't get tipped off about that. How much do you let a politician know about a story and the angle that you're working on?
Context is important. That sounds like a question for, I don't know, if you're working on a newspaper story. I worked in newspapers, and you're writing a really specific story and you're asking for them for their view on something, you'll be pretty transparent about what you're trying to do, I think. I think if you're asking for commentary on something, you need to be quite transparent. I don't believe in smoke and mirrors and tricking people, calling at the last minute to trick them, which I think some people do, that last minute kind of thing. I'm quite upfront about it. I don't know you, Barrie. I just think if I've got the story, I've got the story. If I need their view, I'll say, well, if you don't participate, you're out of it, and the story actually implicates you in some way.
Give you an example, though, where I would be very cautious. Say if, for example, I got a sense that they're about to move people off Nauru, and I had this on very good information, I would leave it to the last minute before I contacted the Department of Home Affairs or Peter Dutton's office, because what can happen is that they think, right, the ABC's got a story, we know it's about to break, so they will then give it to one of their friendlier journalists, and that journalist will put their spin on it. And so they get it out before you get an opportunity to do it. That's why, it depending on who you're dealing with.
It does.
But I'd be very careful in terms of when I contact people, when I'm sure of my facts, and I'm only going through the process of paying them the courtesy of giving them an opportunity to respond, and I'd leave it until the last minute.
Oh, look, and that is about, you're right, it's individual circumstances, because I've been tricked. Yeah, I've had a story, and then all of a sudden, exactly what you say has happened. And that's very disappointing. But then you know not to trust that particular person. But I generally think you try and, be fair about your practices as much as you can. But if people aren't being fair dinkum with you, if I can use the Prime Minister's word, well, you've got to wonder what their motive is. Yep. Macleay College asks this. Do you feel pressure to say something that benefits a person or a party if they have leaked a story to you?
Well, this has always bothered me, and it happens a lot. Mm-hmm. I've often said that I think it's the fault of editors who put way too much emphasis on breaking stories. They put the pressure on journalists in the press gallery to break stories, and that's how they're going to be judged. Not on the strength of your analysis or the quality of your writing, it's how often you break a story. If you put too much weight on the journalist in that regard, then that's what they go out and do, yep. And they pay a price for it. Some journalists have been known to get a breaking story and then within a week or so saying something really complimentary about the person who leaked the story. That's the deal. It's a trade-off, and that does bother me, and it happens a lot. I'm never really guilty of it myself, because I think at the ABC we're in a kind of a different position, that we don't have the ability to give a politician a leg up in the way that some people do.
Yeah, look, I feel like I don't do it. I mean, I can only report what I do. I agree that I see it happening all the time, and I think it's actually toxic in journalism. I don't think there should be a reward system for providing people with stories, but if you don't provide the favour, and I don't, well, sometimes you don't get the payoff as well. And what I mean by that is people don't want to talk to you. Oh, well, I think it's worth it to keep your integrity, so I'm just going to keep going with the way I do it, Barrie.
Okay. What if they insist that you don't cover certain topics?
Kind of gone to that, haven't we, a bit? Insist. Has anyone insisted? Yeah, actually, yeah. I can think of a few times they've said, I don't really want to talk about this. The way I've handled it is to tell them that we're going to anyway. How do I put that? I say, I can't do that. And then they'll say, well, I don't want to talk about blah, blah. You always want to talk about blah. I don't want to talk about that. And I'll say, I have to talk about that. That's on the news agenda. I suppose we can't do it if you don't. And often they'll go, all right, I'll still do it. But I just say it. I just say, you have to be willing to lose the interview. And I have lost an interview where I've thought, I can't participate in this rule because I think it's unethical and I can't live with myself. I can't lay down straight in bed.
Yeah, I had a case where one minister, somebody from their office told me the minister didn't want me raising a certain topic. It was a private matter, but it became public and it was part of the political dialogue. And I said no, that I wouldn't. There's no way that I would agree not to raise that topic, even though I hadn't made up my mind as to whether I would. And I got a call back later saying, I don't know that the minister's fine with that. So, if you're up front with them,
got to be up
they're
front.
Fine.
All right. Have you ever snapped and said exactly what you think, Barrie? Snap at me. Go crazy.
I don't know that I have. Maybe I've overreacted sometimes to something they've said, and I've kind of lost my cool slightly. But I don't think I've snapped in the way that I've just taken them on and decided that you're talking bullshit. I haven't said anything along. What about you?
Oh, look, there was one incident only, and it was early on in my broadcast career because I was in newspapers before, where I was interviewing, I'm not going to name it, but you could probably Google it and figure it out, a backbencher who was saying incredibly controversial things about Indigenous remote communities. Now, I covered Indigenous affairs for years. I've been to a lot of remote communities. I think that they're an important part of Australia. I don't think you should say denigrating things about Aboriginal people living in remote communities. And I just lost my cool a bit. And a bit snappy, and I wasn't happy with my tone. I don't think it gave much to the audience. And I learned a lesson from it, which is, you've got to actually... I can have those views, and I'm basically declaring them here. I have really strong views about Indigenous rights, but you have to watch yourself and you have to keep a really fair tone. So,
yeah, the how and the why questions are still important, but one word that I find really works every time is somebody does say something quite outrageous, and you come back, really? And it gives them no time to think, because it's just one word, and then they have to keep going. And they immediately, there's doubt in their mind, or have I just gone over the top? But it really works. Okay, how do you control personal political views when covering elections, especially on election night?
No. It's a no-brainer. It's not even an issue for me. What personal political view?
Yeah.
Most of the political personal views I have are about competence, fairness, transparency. I'm hardwired as a journalist, so people often think, "Are you secretly partisan?" No. When I can see bad governments doing bad things and not being transparent, I've seen it on both sides of politics. So I don't find it hard to. Because I don't have a team, I'm not in a team, I don't want to be in a team, I have zero interest in the teams, but I want the teams to do a good job when they get elected. So in fact, I often say to people, and they get shocked, I want to see a Liberal government do a great job. I want to see a Labor government do a great job, because that's good for Australia.
Yeah.
It shocks people, but actually I'm a journalist and I care for my country. That's why I do this job. So I like to call it out equally.
Yeah. I get tested sometimes on issues around race. That really does bother me at times. But in the end, you just have to control it, and it's better just to be measured and ask the relevant questions around that, and let people decide. Is it yours?
I think it's you, isn't it?
Okay.
Well, it is now.
This is from Deakin University. What do we do if we're doing vox pops and no one seems to care that there's an election on, or even know, perhaps?
Then you use that, because that's the point of vox pops. You're actually finding out how the community feels. So
make it a virtue.
Correct. If you're doing vox pops, it happens all the time, and I think they're some of the best vox pops. And people say, "Is Malcolm Turnbull the Prime Minister? Isn't Paul Keating still the Prime Minister?" Various other things that are a bit out there sometimes. I think that is the best way to get a good view and cross-section of how ordinary Australians feel about politics. So you include them, you use them, and I think they tell a story about how people feel about politics.
A comedian went into Bondi, I think, and did some interviews recently, asked a bunch of people at random who the Prime Minister was. And I think about 30% answered correctly, Scott Morrison. Some couldn't even name a Prime Minister at all.
And that tells the story, right?
That was the context, and the guy got his gag, didn't he?
A guy got his gag, yeah. So I think they're really important. You've got to use actually what you get to. You're not searching for something. You're not trying to create the story. The story is, what do you find when you genuinely go to Flinders Street, or you go to whatever. All right. What if I'm a member of a political party? Do I need to disclose that in my stories? Yes.
Oh, absolutely. But it disturbs me that if anybody is a member of a political party, I mean, if there is a journalist, maybe there are, I don't know, but I don't think that's wise to be a member of a political party and then present yourself as an objective journalist. You can't be.
Unless you're the food writer, maybe.
Yeah, no, I'd rather think that journalists are not members of political parties.
I think it's a strict rule. No.
Yeah, when I worked for Hawke, just quickly, I'd been working for him for a year or so, and a senior minister came to me and said, "It's come to my notice that you're not a member of the Labor Party." And I said, "Well, I didn't know that was a prerequisite." "Well, people are starting to talk." She sent me along to a party meeting, and I sat down with the credential committee with one guy who was in his 80s. And he said to me, "What do you do?" And I said, "I'm Senior Press Secretary to Bob Hawke." He said, "Oh, yeah." Okay. I said, "Now, what happens from here?" And he said, "Well, you need to pay $20. You've got to fill out a form, and you have to attend 3 meetings before your eligibility kicks in. I didn't fill out a form. I didn't pay $20, and I didn't go back. So I dealt with that. But I felt I'd reached my obligation. All right. The University of Sunshine Coast. How do you approach people who you haven't spoken to before?
Look, I think it's a fundamental characteristic of a journalist. If you can't approach people you don't know, then probably journalism isn't right for you. So.
If you're afraid of people.
Yeah, journalism is essentially about people, people's stories, whether it's political, and we've been largely talking about politics, they're the political stories, the policy stories. So how do you approach them? You pick up the phone and you go, "Hi, my name is Patricia Karvelas. I work for the ABC. Can we have a meeting, or can I interview you?" You just approach them. You cold call people, you email people, you go up to people on the street. You do need a level of confidence. Sometimes you get knockbacks. People don't want to talk to you. I have been, it's not, if you've got a problem with being rejected, it might not be the best career for you. Rejection is a big part of journalism. I don't care about being rejected personally. I don't know about you, Barrie. I don't care.
If you're a journalism student and you want to interview another journalist, a senior journalist or a politician, just send the email. What's the worst that can happen? They say no. You
have to make the contact, though. You have to be not afraid of anything.
Yep.
And that's really, key. All right, this question's from RMIT. If a politician obfuscates and doesn't answer, how many times can you ask a question again before it appears rude?
Yeah, well, my best experience with that was with Kelly O'Dwyer when she came onto the program, and the government, all senior ministers at that point, were refusing to concede that they had delayed the Royal Commission unreasonably, and so I was prepared to put the question. I expected her to deal with it. I really thought she would put that issue behind her, and when she didn't, I thought, uh-oh, here we go. And so I kept at it 4 or 5 times, and still she wasn't, there was no way she was going to make any admission around that. So at some point in your own mind, I think you say, right, now, I'm satisfied the audience now appreciates I've tried. And if I keep going, it just becomes monotonous and silly. The one thing that I have learned through, particularly now in the era of social media, but in the feedback that we get, is the one thing that really irritates the audience is when you let them off the hook.
Yep.
If you ask a question and then let it go, if they obfuscate or they don't deliberately, if they deliberately avoid answering the direct question that you asked, you have to keep going back. Otherwise, you really piss them off.
I completely agree. And I think you've also got to be prepared that people will think you sound rude. So I'm a bit of a repetitive question asker. I'm known for a bit of repetitive question asking.
Yep.
It's my thing. I also don't care if you think I'm rude. I don't think I'm there to cuddle politicians. If they came on for a cuddle, they probably should go home and cuddle their children, who probably love them, you hope. But that's not my job. Sometimes it can sound rude. I think that's part of my job. Now, you can try and use a lovely tone. I don't think you need to sound awful, but I do think you need to do it. But you need to find a fine line, and that is really, there's no science to this, is there, Barrie? There's no, 5 times and then it's over. You've got to kind of go with your own instincts, and often I will name it. I will say, okay, I've now asked 5 times, you clearly don't want to answer, but, you know, I'm sure our listeners will take that on, you know, will take that note of that.
Yeah,
I'll just say it.
You're clearly not answering the question, we'll move on.
Correctamundo.
Okay, Edith Cowan University. When does opinion become disinformation or fake news?
Well, I think opinion, firstly, should always be branded as opinion. If it's opinion, you've got to say it's opinion. I think that's really important. It sounds really obvious, but it's not, actually. Sometimes it's masked. And I do believe, for instance, in newspapers, it should be kept in different sections and really clearly labelled. I think that stuff is very important. I also think if it becomes fake news when you use... So opinion can be based on, you know, making an argument. Arguments are really important. People should be making them, but they should be based on fact.
The expression fake news, right, that was once clearly understood by everybody, I think, to mean disinformation that was deliberately put out there, or propaganda. And that was reasonable. But then from the Trump era onwards, fake news is now, it's something that politicians use to defend themselves against criticism, to defend themselves against any negative suggestions, so that it's become really annoying, I mean, to me, that fake news is now used to insulate politicians from attacks. Fake news is not legitimate claims being made in the media. Fake news is genuine, deliberate disinformation that's put out there to try and distort things, and it works. BuzzFeed did a survey on this, and they found that in the American election, the disinformation matched the lead stories in the major newspapers in terms of content. So it's... The fake news thing now is it's a dreadful insulation that the politicians use, when that's not. It doesn't mean that the story is wrong. It doesn't even mean the story is necessarily wrong. It's deliberate disinformation. Yeah,
that's right. And I think journalists should call it out too, and not be afraid to do it. Even in an interview, when politicians will say, "Oh, that's fake news," I'll say, "No, it's not, Minister. No, it's not." And you need to call it out, and it's our job to actually protect the facts, because there are facts. There's no grey, there are actually facts. And you can have opinions, but you can't make up facts. Edith Cowan University has a question. If you, so this is a very funny question, so I'm trying to keep a straight face. If you could egg a politician, who would you egg, Barrie?
Look, I don't think it'd be wise for me to egg any politician. And I don't think it would be wise for me to nominate one that I would like to if I had the freedom to do so.
Not wise.
I might say, though, the egg boy showed great judgment. Can I get away with that?
I reckon you have. Yeah, look, I'm keeping my eggs in my omelettes, personally. I actually quite like eggs. I'm going to stick to eating them. Greek Easter, we smash them together. Easter's happening. Look, yeah. Yeah, there are some politicians who are sometimes unpleasant, especially to journalists, let's be honest. And I just think our viewers, our listeners are pretty clever and they figure that out themselves. We don't have to do any egging.
I think we're all done.
We're done. See you,
Barrie.
Barrie.
Fun. Bye.
As we've just seen, that was a masterclass in political reporting and interviewing. And you can also see that often things can be done in several ways and that the best way to approach your story isn't always simple. As you report for this project, you'll come up against many of these same dilemmas. And we appreciate that as student reporters, candidates may not be as responsive with you as they might be with Patricia or Barrie. So when you hit a wall or face a dilemma, whether it's legal or ethical, talk it out with your fellow students or go to your tutors, because the chances are they've faced many of the same problems in their careers. Have fun, let your curiosity guide you, and we look forward to seeing your stories on the Junction and watching your work on election night.